All right. Hello, everyone. Sorry for the slight delay. We had some technical issues. I'm checking my admin to see if everybody can hear me. Okay, so let's get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm very excited to be here today to talk about getting the most out of Android KTX. Small little trivia. So Android Makers, actually DroidCon Paris, like the conference before Android Makers, was the first conference I ever got the opportunity to speak at. And now it's going to be my first virtual conference that I'm going to speak at. So pretty stoked about that. Before we get started, a small little word about myself. So I'm Jeroen Mols. I'm Google Developer Expert for Android. And I currently work at Plaid. We actually build a financial API that empowers innovators by delivering them access to the financial system. Oh, I need to enable screen share. All right, is this fixed? Perfect. All right. So just so you can also see the first slide, I'll go back one. So this was my introduction slide. Here I introduced myself. And now we're going to get started. So today I want to talk to you a bit about like what Android KTX is and why we actually need it. Give you a little crash course on what KTX methods I find most useful, and also like give you some extra hints how you could write your own and how you can actually go and discover more. So without further ado, what is it and why? Well, Android can sometimes be tedious. I think we probably all already have experienced that. And this is like one of the prime examples to me. If you want to create your own custom view and then do something with the width and height, you actually need to wait for the view to be laid out before you can actually like use the width and height. So for instance, if you want to create a rectangular image view, if you want to do that yourself, then you need to register an onLayout listener. And this is 12 lines of code just to be able to do this one useful thing like do on width and height known. But this isn't just the only problem, because if you forget to unregister the listener, yeah, then you may end up with a leak. And also, what happens if you register the listener after the view has already been laid out? Then this layout change listener won't be called anymore, right? So there's quite some issues with this. It's very verbose. You could end up with a leak, and there's also like a race condition possible. So wouldn't it be nice if you can do this in just one line of code where you say like view.doOnLayout and then just execute your lambda? Well, this is exactly what KTX provides. And if you now look at the KTX implementation, we can actually see that, so in the happy part, they just call doOnNextLayout, and they invoke your lambda after the next layout. But there's also an optimization in there, so they check whether your view is already been laid out, and then they immediately call your lambda. So in that sense, the race condition can no longer happen, and it would also be a bit faster. And there's even an extra optimization that makes sure that like if there's a layout pending, yeah, then this obviously shouldn't happen because you want to have the fresh data when your lambda is invoked. And then if you look at the function signature, so it makes use of a lot of like powerful Kotlin features. So it's an inline function, meaning that there won't really be any significant runtime overhead. It's an extension function on view, so you can just call it within a view as if it's a member function. And then lastly, it uses a lambda as the last parameter. So that actually makes sure that if you call this function, you can move the lambda outside of the brackets to get this DSL-like syntax. If you now look at the doOnNextLayout function, well, also this one, yeah, it actually looks pretty recognizable, I guess, because this is the code that we had before, but here they just like take care of all of the heavy lifting for us. So what is Android KTX? Most Android X libraries or most Jetpack libraries, they're still written in Java, which means that they're not always easy or like most idiomatic to use from Kotlin. So this is what KTX tends to provide. They provide like extension functions to not just make Android X easier to use, but also to make it more idiomatic from Kotlin. And they make use of like a lot of Kotlin Lambda language features, like extension functions, extension properties, coroutine support, operator overloading, and so on. But to me, it's also a lot about making your life easier. So it's not just making your code idiomatic, but also have somebody else solve tricky problems for you, like with the onLayout case. But this doesn't just exist for like Android X. It also exists for the Android platform, because that was also written in Java. And then it also exists for even some Firebase or Plaid core libraries. So how you use KTX? Well, you need to make sure you depend on the Google repository. And then instead of using the normal artifact, you can just add a suffix to it. So instead of using core, you use core KTX, and that's it. Then you get the KTX artifact. But here things get a little tricky, because not every Android X library will have a KTX artifact, which makes sense, right? Because some Android X libraries are actually written in Kotlin, like Jetpack Compose, like the paging library, benchmarking library. So there won't be a KTX artifact for every Android X library, and not every Android X library will even need a KTX artifact. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is there are even KTX artifacts for non-Android X libraries. So this entire situation to me is like, at the very least, pretty confusing. So yeah, it is just what it is. Look at the reference documentation to see where there are KTX artifacts for. I often use maven.google.com myself to just see like which library has a KTX artifact, and make sure to always depend on the KTX artifact if you're using Kotlin. So time for a crash course. Animations. So if you want to listen to animation progress, you need to override an animation listener and implement all of these 4 methods. This looks quite okay because I already cleaned up quite a lot of things, and I'm using Kotlin with like expression bodies. But if you do this in Java, it's going to be even more verbose. Thanks to Android X, on the other hand, we can just do like, hey, do on start, do on repeat, do on cancel. This is just way easier to read. Similarly, there's also extension functions for the pause listener, and Transitions API has something similar like this. Next up, system services. So way back in the day, if you wanted to get a system service, you had to ask for the system service by name and then cast it to the right type. But thankfully, that's no longer required. If your min SDK is Android M, then you can get a service by class. But Android KTX actually provides a very easy method where you can just say like, hey, get system service, this is the type, and then you just get the entire type back, which works on any Android version. Shared preferences. So if you want to, shared preferences is one of these APIs that I don't really like, because you need to make sure that you call like the terminal operator. You need to call apply or commit. If you don't, then simply your code has a bug. And this is something that Android X provides pretty elegantly, because here you do an edit. In the edit, you actually have a lambda where you have access to the shared preferences, and then they automatically apply things for you. So you can no longer forget to call apply. If you prefer to do a commit instead, so it's persisted to disk, you can, and then you can just provide it as a parameter to the methods. For colors, colors are another not very intuitive API on Android. If you want to convert a string to a color, you need to use color.parseColor. But Android X can actually provide you a very simple extension function on the string. If the string looks like a color, then you can just do like dot to color int, and then you just get the color int. And similarly, you can convert that int into a color drawable. URI and file. You can convert a string very easily to an URI, a URI very easily to a file, and a file very easily to a URI. These are just like very handy functions, but you need to know about them to know whether they exist or not. Then for view, we already discussed view, the doOnLayout, but there's actually other methods like doOnNextLayout, on predraw, on attach, and so on. And there's also extension properties that allow you to access the margins of a view very easily. Even more, there is like an extension method that allows you to update the layout parameters. So normally you need to get the layout parameters, cast them to the right type. And then when you have the right type, you can set some values or change some values on that. And you need to remember to also apply those variables back, or those layout parameters back to the view. Here you can just do it in one method, and within the method you actually have strong type access to the constraint layout parameters in this case. something to update the padding, so you only have to provide one padding, otherwise you have to specify all four, and then also a very handy method to convert a view to a bitmap. Then visibility, this is one of my favorite ones. So visibility on Android is tricky or more complex than it should be because visibility is a tri-state. It's either visible, invisible, or gone. And then you would have to actually do an equals to know like what the visibility state of your view is. But thanks to KTX, you can just check like, hey, is this view visible? Then do this. If it's not, then do that. And you can also just assign the visibility as being a boolean. And what Android X will do under the hood is it will map a non-visible view to like view.gone. So it's compatible with view.invisible, but it will only use view.gone, which makes sense in most cases. Then for view group, very similar. So you can easily check whether a view group contains a particular view. You can iterate over all of the views in a view group. And there's also like plus equals and minus equals operator overloads to very easily like add or remove a view from a view group. All right, let's move to text view. So yeah, probably you don't want to listen to like text changes of a text view, but from an edit text, which is a subclass of text view, that's like a pretty common use case. And if you want to do that in the default way, you need to, again, like implement or subclass a pretty large interface. Whereas with Android KTX, you can just say, hey, do this after text change or before text changed on text changed. To view models. So view models, I'm a very big fan of that, but the ABI, to be very, it's not really the most easy one to use because I think also a view model provider exists, but you need to call view model providers off. And yeah, it's not very easy to use, but the KTX artifact actually provides a delegate property, so you can just on your fragment say like, hey, this is a val view model. I want it to be instantiated by view models. And then all of this just simply happens under the hood. This is if you're doing this in an activity. If you're doing it in a fragment, though, you need to decide whether you want to attach the view model to the fragment or to the activity. And that you can actually also do in a more natural way by saying by view models, then your view model is attached to the fragment. But if you say by activity view models, then your view model will be attached to the activity. And if you want to provide a custom factory to create your view model, of course, that's also supported. And then you just have to like provide a lambda to the delegate property. Transactions, very similar to shared preferences. Also here, you need to remember to call the terminal operator commit. But with Android KTX, you don't have to do that anymore. You can just say like, hey, fragment manager.commit, and then you just immediately have access to the fragment manager, and you can do fragment transactions. Coroutines, I'm guessing most of you are familiar with coroutines. If you're not, that's not a problem. So coroutines is Kotlin's new threading mechanism. And the main benefit of coroutines are that it's structured concurrency. So whenever you create a coroutine, you basically need to say like, I'm going to attach this coroutine to this scope. So for instance, you attach a coroutine to your activity scope, to your fragment, or to your view model. And what's really nice about that is that when your view model or fragment gets destroyed, then also all of the work attached to that scope will get canceled and cleaned up automatically. So in order to make coroutines easier to use, there's extension properties where you can just access for an activity fragment or view model a default scope where you can just launch your coroutines in. And if these are then destroyed, everything will be cleaned up. And this was just like a very, very quick run through. I also didn't want to make this too long because it's hard to like keep your attention to it. But if you want to learn more, there's like a full list of extensions. The reference above is like the ones I find most useful, but maybe you're using Room and then you need some extra extension methods. Okay, but you could also write your own. For instance, imagine like something I built for recently is a financial app. And finances, they only have like 2 digits, so a number in finances, yeah, there's no smaller unit than euro cents. So then you want to have your edit text be limited to 2 decimals. So what I wanted to have is like a very simple method to call on the edit text, like, hey, limit this to 2 decimals. And that's something you can easily write. You create an extension function on edit text, and then, okay, the implementation is quite a bit involved. I'm not going to cover that here, but it's just to spark your interest, like how you can also transform your own code base and make it easier to understand. Similarly, for a toast, I'm still baffled how complex toasts are to use. So why don't you just define your own extension method on fragment or on activity or on both, and then you just reference that to the toast, so you can't forget to call show anymore. All of the toasts will have the same length, just a hell of a lot easier to use. Similarly, for a float, I'm not really going to cover these given the time, but yeah, you get the idea. You can create like functions that are very easy to read, like, hey, is this a decimal number? Or only show like, convert this to like decimals or a round number. And then also similarly, if you use a tab layout, yeah, there is no doOnTab selected, but it's pretty easy to write that yourself. You just create an extension function, and then you implement the listener, and only in the one you're interested to you actually invoke the listener. If you want to discover more, these are 3 handy links. So the top one is the main KTX documentation. There's a list of all KTX extension functions, and you can even dive into the source code, which I highly recommend to do. You can also click through from Android Studio, by the way, but that gives you like more ideas on how you can also like apply these principles to your own code base. So let's wrap things up. So KTX is actually officially, it's meant to make your code, your Android code, more idiomatic. But to me, honestly, it's more about like simplifying your development, offloading difficult problems to others, and then also by doing so, reducing the amount of errors you would actually make. KTX to me is also more than just a library, but a concept, something that can be applied to many things. So you can also write your own, you can fill in gaps of missing functionality, and look at the source code to be inspired. They make use of like the Kotlin language features, like cross-inline and so on, stuff that I wasn't familiar with. They make use of that like plenty, and then you also start getting the idea of like why those things matter and what they can be used for. If you like this content, I also quite actively blog, so feel free to check that out. For instance, I blog about like a modularization architecture, feature flagging architecture, and plenty of more stuff. And then also the image credits. I didn't make the Lego image myself, unfortunately, but the author is French. Please, please, if you're bored, just go to his Flickr page and then like check out the images from Lego he makes. It's going to be the best afternoon you waste this week. I guarantee you that. And that's basically it. Thanks all for coming to my talk. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm quite active there, and every time I release new content, you will find it on Twitter. And I'm now going to see if there's any questions, and then I'll try to answer those. Let me pull up the question link. Dear admin, can I have the question link? Okay, cool. So let me just give me a second. All right, and then now where were the questions? All right. Okay. Are there scenarios where you do not recommend extension functions? Yeah, sure. So extension functions, they have a static context, which means that they are hard to test, right? So if you have an extension function on a class, then basically that class, you can no longer mock it within your tests. So something that I'm a very big fan of is creating private extension functions within a class. So then you still have like the downside that it can't be tested, but the scope is limited and you can still implicitly test it. And you can have the upside of having very readable codes. So I think extension functions, they are great, but they don't really have it's hard to get them properly organized, and also they can be hard to test. So if you overuse them, there's definitely going to be some challenges doing that. Next question. If you use KTX for something like the text watcher, Do you still need to provide all the override methods, or can you just implement the ones needed? Good question. So this is, yeah, it depends a bit what you do, right? So if you use, so KTX already provides text watcher, then you can just use the one you needed. So then you can just say do after text change, and that's it. If you don't care before the text change or when the text has changed, then you don't have to subscribe anything. And if you subscribe more, then actually, yeah, Android X will take care of that for you. Your t-shirt is disturbing. Well, it's actually a sweater. So dodge that bullet. And how did you do your presentation with both camera and slides? Well, yeah, I have a split screen on my Mac, and I have an ultra-wide monitor, so then I have a lot of space, and I'm just sharing my full screen. Okay, any other questions? Let me check what the admin is saying. All right, so then I'll suggest we wrap up here. Thanks again, everyone, for being here. I had a great time, and have an awesome Android makers. See ya.